and welcome to We Speak Loud podcast. And let me do a brief intro about myself. My name is Sandy, and I started this podcast just last month about speaking up. And my mission is to help people find their voices through sharing their stories. And you are my second guest on this podcast.
Great.
So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Let's see. I currently live out in Florida and moved down here from Boston before the pandemic, but was born and raised in California.
Oh, perfect.
What else? I'm a wellness coordinator at a local community college, and I've been in the public health industry my whole life.
Awesome. When did you move to Florida?
About 3 years ago now. About 3 years ago, yeah. It was right before the pandemic. We just thought it was really cold up in Boston, and we moved down here because we liked the weather, and it was just nicer down here. And then all of a sudden we got here and we locked down. So it was tough.
Tell me a little bit about that. I'm pretty sure getting, you're moving to this new place and all of a sudden it's a pandemic. Tell me that experience.
It was rough because we didn't have a lot of close friends here yet. We had moved into new construction, coming from Boston, where, your houses are built a while back, unless they're new builds. And, so they're old houses. So we moved down here with a house we didn't have to fix for the next 10 years after we moved in, which was great. But we also didn't have a lot of local neighbors. We didn't have a lot of just a circle of friends yet. So we got here, we got my daughter into school, and, we were starting to get settled and a little bit more like, okay, we know where the grocery store is. We know where, our dentist is, that kind of thing. And then they said, we're going to close down, for spring break and maybe a week or two after that, but then we'll be right back. And then we didn't go back. So yeah, it was isolating.
Yeah, I got that. I'm pretty sure it was isolating for everyone, like all of us too.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, how was your childhood like growing up?
Yeah, so my childhood was actually pretty good, I think, for the first 9 years. I had 3 sisters, 2 older, 1 younger. I had 2 parents who did love us so much. They worked really hard for us. They were the kind of people, traditional, I think, Chinese parents, where they just worked 24/7 and attempted to dote on us as much as they could, but it was all about work. But I knew that they loved us. And so by the time I showed up, it was about 9 or more years after my mother and father started having kids and everything. So by the time I came around, things were better. My father's restaurant was making money. And so we could do some extracurricular activities. We all got in, a couple of us got into dance. So everything was pretty solid and pretty normal, I think, for us for the first 9 years. And then my father got sick when I was 9 and very suddenly passed away. He had pancreatic cancer. And so it really threw our family off. My mother I always considered them to be kind of the true loves, that one true love in your life. And so she had to deal with the death of my father and raising 4 daughters by herself quite suddenly. And so she didn't handle that as gracefully as one might. And so, yeah, it was that part then became really tough because I was the creative kid who thought differently and didn't follow the rules and all of that. And then here she's got 4 kids that she needs to kind of keep alive and in order and and proper, and I was not going to do that. so the second half of my childhood was a little bit more traumatic, I guess. I mean, I was the fighter in the family, not physically fighter, I can't fight like that, but I was much more willing to go head to head with her, whereas my sisters were a little bit more, and they've even said it, they followed the rules. They did what they were told, and I was the one who didn't. So the childhood was was a mix. I got the first half was good and happy, I think, and I knew I had parents who loved me, if it's only because they worked so hard for us. And the second half was a little bit rougher. So
Yeah, I can imagine like losing your dad at such a young age. And I somehow relate to your story too. Like I my dad my mom is still alive, but my first half of the childhood was good, it was great. And in my second half, it's when I started to, you know, be a little more depressed and quiet. I didn't really want to talk or engage. And so I really do relate to parts of your story.
Yeah. The change. I mean, I think I hear some stories where it's consistently rough the whole childhood, and then there's these where something happens midway through, and just maybe it's childhood development, normal stuff where peer groups and everything get really a lot more challenging, or something happens. And so yeah, that change can be whoo. I know for me it threw me off. So
yeah, I'm also very much like you, where I'm also creative, but I also don't follow the rules, and I always got in trouble with my all the time.
Yes, all the time. Exactly. And like I said, I was the one who, same thing. It was like, I didn't just get in trouble, but then I fought you on it. And I can't imagine how tough that must have been for my mother. I mean, it's one thing, I have a daughter, and she's a teenager now. So it's been tough, and I've been attempting to do things differently. But my mother with 4 daughters and all going through, those developmental years, it's just, wow, I can't, yeah, that plus grief is too much. So,
yeah. Can you briefly describe how your parents were like when you were young, and like, yeah, just briefly describe your parents.
My mom was born here in the United States. She had a lot of siblings. She was very devoted to her family, but she wanted to teach school. And I believe because where she grew up in the South, she couldn't teach school. I think it was because she was female. I think that was what was going on at the time. So she moved to California to teach school because she could teach in California. My father was born and raised in China, came over when he was 6, and he was at school for college for a couple of years, and then he wanted to open up his own restaurant. So they met in California, and I was raised there. What were they like? I thought my dad had a great sense of humor. I think he was very devoted to his family. He had 4 daughters, which in some respects was tough because there were no boys in the family, and I know how important it is to have a boy. But with 4 daughters, I remember the stories about him treating us like gold. Like, he really did treat us fairly, and I thought that was really cool. My mom was a little bit tougher, I think, with having 4 daughters, and maybe being raising us around my father's family, who I always got the impression was more traditionally Chinese. So there was always a properness that she was attempting to live up to, a standard that she wanted to live up to, that maybe didn't happen in the family she grew up in, but was happening with my father's side of the family, or that she perceived. So she was always, there was just that properness that she was, acceptableness that she was aiming for. So I think we were raised with both of those. My mom put some pressure on us to be outstanding, proper, appropriate Chinese kids or children, daughters. Whereas my dad didn't care as much, it seemed like. Strangely enough, he didn't care. So I remember one time there was a Chinese banquet that we were going to. And I, for some reason, wanted to wear, I think they were Jordache jeans, which was very improper to wear to a Chinese banquet. And I fought, and I wanted to wear those jeans, whereas everyone was in frilly dresses, proper dresses. And I remember my mom and dad fighting over it, and my mom refusing to let me leave the house with them, whereas my father said, just let her wear the jeans. I won, dad won, if you will. I went to the Chinese banquet. I was wearing jeans. It doesn't matter how improper or uncomfortable I felt. I loved every minute of it, that I won. And so, but my dad didn't care as much. So it was this weird dichotomy of proper, improper in my family. So if that kind of describes them.
Yeah, like I can totally relate to that. Like there's a lot of times growing up, my mom would fight with my dad, and like I would get in trouble, and then my dad would like, no, it's okay, it's okay. She's just a little kid, like let it be. And my mom, and that's when they fight. And I'm just like, and then you're just sitting there like, you know, because my mom usually the one that wins, and so
Yeah.
and so like my dad kind of like I can kind of get away with things, but my mom would just be the, you know, controlling one. And
Yep.
so, like as a kid when they fight, I was like, oh my god, like they fight a lot, and then I'm like, am I in trouble? Like, am I the bad one? You know, maybe I shouldn't say anything. And I started to just blame myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, has that ever happened to you?
That I ever had to explain myself?
No, like
It was, right. It was weird. In our family, there were all there. We were out. The parents were outnumbered. There were 4 of us, and so there was this fierceness that I had, which is what got me in trouble later. But there was a fierceness that I had that it was like, if I'm going to fight for something, I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to give up. I will kind of like die on this hill. And that didn't set well with my family, and definitely after my father passed did not set well with my mother. But I don't remember ever at that point consciously feeling like, was I the cause of the fight? Because I kind of knew I was the cause of the fight. I liked being the cause of the fight, which was terrible, but it's true. But I wanted things my way. I don't know if it was selfishly, probably selfishly, but also I just had a lot of confidence when I was younger. So I don't know if I ever apologized to my mom, or and probably I should have, but I don't remember ever doing that.
yeah, I was always not confident. I didn't want to fight with my mom. Me and my brother are same thing, like very quiet, and we just don't really want to get in too much involved in like fighting with her sometimes, because she always wins.
Yes.
But as I grew up, like that's when I started to be more rebellious, and I'm like more rebellious, and just kind of like, because you know, typical Asian families, they kind of spank you a lot. And then when I was 13 or 14, I was like, she was like hitting me with one of those coat hangers.
Okay.
I was like, go ahead, but it hurt. But I'm like, go ahead, because I can take it now.
Right.
I
Right.
got more rebellious and didn't listen to her as much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, see, I think I would have been like that. And I was like that when I was a teenager, when I got into your teenage rebellious years. What changed for me and what got me quiet and what made me lose my voice was right at the end of probably slightly at the end of high school, and maybe sometime in college is when I had to lose my voice before I refound my voice. So it was weird because I was born with a voice, and when my younger years, I knew that, but then something changed later on in life and it shut me up like whoosh. And that's when things changed. So only recently, I'd say in the last year and a half or so, am I really refinding my voice, if that makes sense. So I guess that's a little bit of a different thing. I think it would have benefited my mother if I hadn't been as loud and bold and confident and creative when I was younger, and found that later on, but I had it out of the womb. And then she had to, I think out of fear, maybe this is something that all Chinese parents feel. So you kind of let me know what you think about this. But somewhere in my childhood, later childhood, in order to keep, or for her to feel like we were safe, the four of us daughters were safe, she used a lot of, or told me a lot of stories attempting to affect me. So she said everything from, if you do that, you could get hurt and you could die. And I was like, I don't care. Or she'd say, you don't want to do that because you'll get a bad grade. And I was like, I'll risk it. And then she would throw all these at me, attempting to quiet me. And if you will, none of them really stuck until one really did. And it was a big one. So for me, my mother shut me up. And I don't think she intentionally tried to do that. I think she was intentionally trying to keep me safe and was worried for having a daughter out in the world who was bold and creative and confident, and that she thought that would put me at risk. She told me a story that if I was bold and loud and confident and intelligent and funny and all the things that I am, that the ancestors would be disappointed in me. These ancestors she's talking about are not like, they're not my aunts and uncles. These are like nameless, faceless, old Chinese entities that I could never otherwise affect. And so they loomed out there larger than life in my life. And they scared the bejeebus out of me, quite honestly. That story to, that if I were really truly who I am, if I remain the person that I was born, that the ancestors would be disappointed in me. And that shut me up for about almost 30 years, 20 years, 30 years. I self-sabotaged. I did all the things that, well, I aimed high, but I never succeeded at anything. And I would blame it on anything that was going on. It was the wrong time, wrong place, those people, whether it was in business, friendship, everything. It was when I got close to being really confident or loud, or if I could win awards, or if I could be bigger in my business or anything like that, then I would self-sabotage. I would all of a sudden shrink. And it was because the story of, if you kind of like get on your ancestors' radars, they're gonna be horribly, terribly disappointed in you. And so for years, I've played small and been quiet and really shrunken. I've shrunken myself. And about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, I started to figure out that didn't seem to work right. And that everyone else was getting the success and the happiness that they wanted, and that I wasn't. And if everyone deserves to have anything they work for, why wasn't I getting what I wanted? And I started doing some really deep work and refound my voice. So yeah, so that's kind of how, it's like just a different version of losing your voice and refinding it. So
yeah, that story really changed your life. And what age were you?
I think when she really drove that story home, I think it was probably in college. I think maybe she had told me the stories in my high school years, but they didn't stick at that point. But in college, I went off to college, so I wasn't around her all the time. And I was getting bolder and more confident, and I loved my degree program. I loved the people I was going to school with. Everything was so good, and I was about to be big and bold. And somewhere in there, I think she told me that story. I really don't have an exact memory of the story, But then she passed away right after I finished my undergraduate work. And I think the combination of that story plus the emotion maybe of when she passed away, and the grief I felt over her loss, somewhere in there just drove it home that now it's time to shut up. You know what I mean? Now is not the time to speak. You've done enough. And I held that story for a long time, for a very long time. So
yeah, it sounds like it could be combination, like her telling that story, and then shortly after, like you complete your undergrad, like she just passed away. It could be multiple things too.
Definitely. So yeah, but it really plays to that whole idea of the stories that you hear, true or not, you know, because obviously my ancestors, dead people, right? Really old dead people are not judging me. And the whole concept that, you know, we are making the next generation better. And so sometimes we have to let the ancestors go. That whole concept of the intergenerational healing exists. And yet the story that I held for so long was so strong. It was so in me that I couldn't even consciously identify it, but it was the program, if you will, that my brain was running all this time. And so self-sabotage was kind of my only option, not understanding or not being completely aware of this story that I was holding. So
yeah, for me, like it's a little different. My mom always told me stories, and it always stuck in my brain a lot, because I'm pretty sure a lot of Asians can relate to this too. Like when your parents compare and contrast your cousin, the friends, and everyone, and
so
then
much.
Yeah, it makes you feel like you're not good enough. And then like I didn't really do very well in school either, and so she would tell me like oh, it's okay, you're slow, I get that. I'm like, what? I was like, okay, now I'm slow and I'm doing bad in school, not doing good in like the state test. So now like it kind of ingrains in your brain that like I'm not smart. And I've been carrying that around for many years, and about not being smart, not being pretty. It's like that, those compare and contrast, it really affects the childhood development.
Absolutely. I mean, I had 3 sisters, so it was the same kind of ideas. Like, well, you're not like your sisters. Why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z like your sisters? And it's like, because they're doing that, and maybe I don't want to do the same thing. Well, that doesn't measure up. Yeah. And that can absolutely, those stories really take a toll on you when you're young. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah, like I guess we can relate to that, like how our parents would compare and contrast, especially our moms.
Right. And I wonder, I mean, I'm curious to see if you interview people, males, men, boys, sons, you know, and who in their family, if anyone, judged them, or how. Because I know that that's a big thing. And now being a mother of a daughter, not of a son, right, of a daughter, that I've done a lot of research, I've done a lot of reading on that mother-daughter relationship, because that is important. How do I do this differently than my mother did? And again, I believe that my mother's heart was in the right place. She wanted to protect me. She wanted to motivate me. She wanted to make sure that I was safe out in the world. I get all of that. Just her way of doing it was really not ideal for me, and probably not ideal for a lot of kids. So yeah, that's an interesting, that mother-daughter thing is, it's a lot.
Let me ask you, was there any like thing your mom said that made you fearful throughout your childhood?
What made me fearful that my mother told me? Honestly, I was such a confident, bold kid that I don't remember there being anything until the ancestor story. So there was one, I'll tell you this story. I must have been 3, 4, 5. And we had a little shed in the backyard where my dad kept the lawnmower. And above that was another shelf, if you will, with a little roof over the top. And it was like our playhouse. So on top of each other, second floor. And I remember I was on the second floor of it. We were playing in the playhouse, and I walked down the stairs and probably down to the third floor to the bottom, to the bottom step. And I jumped from the third step of the bottom to the bottom and jumped to the ground. And I ran in and I said, Mom, I'm the bionic woman, because I just jumped off the top of the playhouse. Now, of course, my mother freaked out and thought, you can't do that. You're going to die. You're going to get hurt. It's going to be terrible. I remember shortly thereafter, my timeline may be off here, but at some point shortly thereafter, we took a trip to Universal Studios in California, where they talk about movie magic, right? So it's how we make movies. And we went to this one particular show where they pulled someone from the audience and they said, okay, you're going to make the movement like you're jumping. You're just standing on this mat. You're going to make the movement like you're jumping. And then you're going to stand, now you're going to pretend like you just landed on the mat, right? And they're going to film this woman, and then they're going to superimpose her over a what do you call it? A fountain. And then, they said, okay, everybody look up on the screens where we've done the movie magic and look at her jump over the fountain and the green screen magic, all that. And my mom looks at me and says, do you see that? That's fake. And I looked at her and went, she just jumped over the fountain. She's not fake. That just happened. My mom was like, oh my gosh. So it's like, I didn't have fear when I was younger, which was probably a bad thing, right? I mean, if you don't have fear, then you will get hurt. You'll get yourself into trouble. So I think my mom was trying to protect me from that. And so she was trying to instill what those lines are, those boundaries are. And I don't know if I could, I knew that if you touch the stove, you're going to get burned. That's a line, that's a boundary, that's a safety thing. But there are other things that were I had no problem pushing past those lines. And so I think her effort to keep me safe and someday successful and respected in my community was to find that place where she could find that fear in me. And that was that story. And I think that's the only one that I recall really sticking, because even the stories of like, don't do that, you could hurt yourself, don't do that, you could get, you could get killed. I was like, yeah, but you might not. She was like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Yes, you could. And I didn't feel that when I was younger. I was fearless. So does that make sense? I think this was the only story that stuck with me for whatever reason, that then literally put fear in me for 20 years. So yeah, or more, 20 or 30 years. So yeah.
I was very fearful because of all the stories she'd be telling me, because my mom came from, she immigrated from China when, I don't know, like when she was like early or late 30s or late 20s. And then she came from the Communist Party in the 50s when she was born. And so that probably the Communist Party probably instilled a lot of fear in her. And absolutely. Her story that she told us, that her dad died at a young age, and then her mom, and then so she had to take care of the whole entire family, like her siblings and stuff, and she had to go to work at a young age. And so it's probably because of what she's been through, all the trauma, that's why she instilled so much fear. Like, I got scolded when I was 19 for taking a bus home late at night, and got home around 9 p.m. and she scolded me. I was 18 and she scolded me for that. And I was just like, what is going on? Like, what's the big deal? It's only 9 p.m. And she just got really upset. And I just had this long talk with her. She's like, her yelling at me for like the whole entire night. She yelled at my brother for coming home at 2 a.m. in the morning for like And like it's like she has all this fear instilled in her, and she watches. I'm not sure about your mom, but my mom watches the news every single day. And
Of course. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I've attempted over all this time to at least kind of reframe that a little bit, and try to remember that all of that fear that she attempted to instill in me and actually successfully instilled in my sisters, I think that they understood that, but that it was in an attempt to either keep us safe or her fear of losing us. You know what I mean? Like 18, you're technically an adult, and you had so much fear instilled in you that no doubt you knew how to keep yourself safe as much as you could, you know, in advance of a crazy situation, right? But to her, I think the loss of us would be devastating to our parents, and especially our mothers, especially of a daughter. So I attempt to reframe that so it's not only trauma. It was traumatic, but that I kind of get where she was coming from. And for me, I feel like that with my mom is like, okay, I get it. She went through some really, same thing, traumatic stuff when she was younger as well. And so it's not just to make me fearful. It is to attempt to keep me safe. Also shut me up for 30 years. So, you know, there's that. So.
Yeah, like in the last couple of years, I started to find my voice, especially last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I'm actually 36 right now. I don't look 36, but I've been.
I love it.
I've been like this for 35 years, and I haven't really, you know, found my voice until last year when I started to raise my hand, and you know, on Zoom and on Clubhouse app, just telling my story and posting my videos on Instagram. That's when I finally found my voice. And this is exactly why I'm starting this podcast, is to help other people share their story, and then have the collective stories where I can, you know, post it on social media, so for other people to look at. Like, we're not all alone here. We're all on the same boat.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's such a big thing in the Asian community, is how do we find our voice and what do we have to say? And we're so that inspired a novel that I'm writing, which is a part of me finding my voice. Is I'm writing about a character who is forced to shut up by the bad guys, if you will, in the novel, in the story, and how my main character has to find her voice in this situation. And it's really fun to write, because it's all the stuff I'm going through for the past year, especially year and a half or so, in terms of how I have had to refine that voice. And what does that voice have to say? Because so often we are regarded as not having a voice. And that's part of the novel I'm writing, is the assumption that those Asian people don't have a voice. They're not going to fight back. They don't need to. They don't want to. If we just overpower them, that they're not going to fight back. And I think that we're at this wonderful junction where we have the opportunity to speak up, and that our voices have meaning, and that it's going to make other people uncomfortable, and it's going to make me uncomfortable to make them uncomfortable. But you know what? It's time.
Yeah, it's time to speak up.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's so awesome that you're writing a book about finding your voice and speaking up.
You know what? I've been only writing for about, which is an interesting now that you just said that, only because you reframed it in my head. Probably about 5-6 years ago is when I started writing, not necessarily for anyone else's eyes, but I picked it up again because I was writing a lot in high school and loved it. And then it fell away. And so now I'm picking it back up and started writing what I call flash memoirs, is taking a moment in time and pausing it and then and then describing the entire moment like in slow-mo. And now that has developed into story writing. And now, well, right now it's a novella, so it's not quite as long as a novel, and it may want to stay that way. I might release it as a novella, but it is about finding the voice and about the process one has to go through to do that, to be ready to make other people uncomfortable and to have to do it anyway. So
yeah. Uncomfortable to be comfortable.
Right.
Yeah, that's really amazing that you're writing. And I was like that too. I always loved writing when I was in high school, but the moment I get the essay, I'm like, I get a bad grade, and I'm like, what is wrong with my essays? And then that's when I determined, like, I'm not a great writer. And I put down writing for many years until recently, like when I woke up from a dream, I was like, hey, I want to write a screenplay. And so I am writing some screenplays right now, and I got, for the past couple of years, I have these writer's block, and I realized parts of my writer's block is because of that ingrained in me that, like, I'm not consistent or I'm not a good writer. But it's also because I was diagnosed with ADHD last year, and then now I'm like, oh, I know why my essays and my writing wasn't consistent, because I kept writing too many stories into one story. And so right now, as of yesterday or 2 days ago, I'm thinking about writing a short film too.
Awesome.
Like, I just got inspired. I was just like putting my hand on the window, and then I'm like, what am I doing that for? And then this would be a really great short film to talk about depression, to describe what depression feels like inside. And so I want to evoke it with like minimal dialogue, but with music and sound and emotions to mimic depression.
I actually had postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety after I had my daughter. And so, yeah, I wrote a lot about that as well. And it's interesting because I think that on the outside, I was a blank slate in terms of you couldn't tell what the emotion was. But inside, the words and the thoughts were really accurate and there and very deep. And to be able to put that into words. Now, I love what you're doing in terms of a screenplay with minimal dialogue, but in a way that shows what it feels like. And this may be, well, I'm just going to say it out loud anyway. I think that there's a stereotype that Asian people can't show emotion.
Oh.
And so, right? And so, or that we just don't, or maybe we're taught not to. And so I love the concept that you're writing something to show a very deep and very universal emotion, unfortunately, especially post-COVID, in a way that isn't as spoken. It's not as, if you will, cognitive or verbal. It is emotional. It is somatic. It is in your body. And that's wonderful. That's amazing. So keep doing that. That's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, so, we're talking about speaking up. We know the importance of speaking up. Do you know how that would affect a person's childhood, not be able to speak up?
Wait, I don't understand the question. Go ahead.
We know the importance of speaking up, and so can you describe how it can impact a childhood or even adulthood not being able to speak up?
Oh, I think for me, now most of my not speaking up mainly happened as an adult, right? But I'm also raising a daughter, so I kind of can see it from the parent point of view as well as from the adult experiencing it. For me, it was lack of success. The results were lack of success in all parts of my life. It was relationships that didn't work out, both friendships and romantic. And it was this, I was on a quest for my entire life. So both of my parents passed away, and they passed away from either delayable or preventable diseases. Okay. And so I always thought that I went into the public health industry because I wanted to provide information that maybe had my parents heard, they would have changed something and they would feel better about themselves, right? So that was why I thought I went into health. But I also look at it as I went into the health field because I didn't feel good and never knew why. So in the process of everything from eating better and going to the gym and having an active hobby and all the kind of more general things that you can do, I also read every self-help book, and I went to every therapist, and I went to every energy medicine practitioner, and I saw every kind of everybody that I could, trying to figure out why I just didn't feel good. And I think that's part of where the depression and anxiety came from, is I internalized this without understanding why I didn't feel good, but I didn't, and I couldn't get out of it. Was it shame? Was it guilt? Was it all this stuff? And I think that it was this internal story that told me, shut up. This internal story that my mother had told me that said, if you're truly who you are, bold or loud or intelligent or funny or all the things that you could be, that you will disappoint the ancestors and you could never make it back. You could never be more than. And I think that goes internal, and that's kind of some of the ways that it affected me as an adult. And now as a parent, I'm really having to look hard at that, because I didn't figure out I had depression and anxiety, postpartum depression and anxiety, until, my gosh, my daughter was probably 3 or 4 when I figured it out. So then it took me about a year of healing. I went to a naturopath and got holistic medicine and healed that part of it, the physical part of depression and anxiety. And I've been able to raise her differently because of it. And then recently, even more recently, really I did the deep dive into my brain, into my heart, into my body, and figured out it was the story that my mother had told me. And the depression lifts even more so, and the ability to have a conversation with my daughter and raise her in a very different way than my mother did or had is huge. And so my hope and my goal is that at least at some point in her young life, I found my voice, and she's able to see me do that, and she's able to see me use my voice in a positive way, even though it's still an ongoing process. So
yeah, I'm really glad that you figured out that was postpartum depression. A lot of times, we don't talk about mental health, and we don't even know what we're feeling, but we're feeling something that's not good in our body. And we know it's there. But we don't really know how to describe that feeling. Because when I had a hard time breathing from drinking Jameson, alcohol, because I don't really drink very much. It's like the Asian can't really handle alcohol very much. And so right. I had a hard time breathing, and I was like, no, I think I might have asthma. And then the school said, no, you have anxiety. And I was like, what is anxiety? I was 24. What are you talking about? I had never had anxiety before. And then when I started to maybe later in my years, I started having more, panic episodes with anxiety. And then I started to look into that more. And I was like, oh, I know what anxiety is now. I had this since I was a kid. And I told this to my brother, and he was like, yeah, me too. I had it when I was a kid too. And so now I know how to describe how anxiety feels like when you feel nervous, when you just overthink a lot. That's anxiety.
Absolutely.
I did fingernails, I did all of that.
Yep. Oh, I remember postpartum, I actually wrote one of my essays on this, just a random essay, was they talk about when you have anxiety and depression, that you are worried about everything, but you don't have the oomph to do anything about it. And one of the things that I had anxiety about was, am I properly, is are other people seeing me in a way that I feel is proper? Like, am I proper? Am I, visually? And one of that was bathing, which they say when you have depression, you stop taking care of yourself. And I knew it up here before that. I understood the concept of that. I could talk about that, but I never felt that until postpartum. I avoided taking showers. And, they always say mothers, they never shower because they're so busy with the baby, blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't because I had an infant that I was trying to take care of. It was because the feeling of moving your clothes off of your arms felt like broken glass. That getting into the shower and the sound of the water hitting the side of the bathtub was deafening to me. That the feeling of the water from the shower head, no matter which part turned, however I turned it, so it was softer or it was harder or it was bigger or it was rain or whatever, that felt like glass was being scraped on my skin, and then you take a washcloth and you rub it on your skin with soap, and I was out of my skin. I was crawling on the ceiling. It was so bad. Then you turn off the water, you step out of the shower, and you dry off to put your clothes on, and that was hell to me. To feel a towel, no matter how soft it felt on your skin, felt horrible to me. It felt like sandpaper. And then you put your clothes on, and it was just like, oh God, I couldn't take it. So not wanting to do that was a big deal to me. So I only showered once a week because I have a baby. It was my excuse. But that whole process of depression and anxiety, it was overwhelming to not just like mental, emotional, but physical. It was what I ate and how I ate it. It was being able to get out of the house, and the little things that were like, we're going to go out for an hour and I bring 16 diapers for the baby just in case we needed, and we got caught up out in the world and we couldn't get back home for 48 hours. Like, I was going down the street. I was fine, and we'd be back in an hour. But the depression and the anxiety was overwhelming. It was, yeah. So I connect with you on that one as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, with depression, like I tried to, not get into a depressed state. But there's moments where like I was just like, there was like a moment where I was crying and crying and crying and crying and crying. And then I was like, it was just like recently, it was a couple weeks ago. And, I'm still trying to find a job, because I just quit healthcare recently because it was very stressful. And so a couple weeks ago, I was like crying. I'm like for like 45 minutes, I was crying. I couldn't stop. I'm like, stop crying. I was like, I don't want to cry. And then I kept blowing my nose, getting a bunch of tissues, and wiping my tears. And I was like, why are you crying? Stop crying. And I couldn't stop crying. And then that's when I just had that willpower to message my friend, like, hey, I'm depressed. And it takes a lot for someone to just go and reach out to someone like, hey, I'm depressed. Even though we haven't really had a chance to talk, but reaching out like that really got me out of that. Okay, I'm done crying. It just, like, I didn't want to go so deep into my thoughts and I'm not good enough, and then keep crying. Because that once you go into the deep down under, it's very hard to get out. Because I've been there with anxiety where I kind of pulled my hair out before because I was so like stressed out and so anxious that like I couldn't get myself out of that state.
Yeah, and it's this combination, I think, I personally, I think it's a combination of sort of the willpower to ask for help. So that's incredibly important to be able to say it out loud. And then I think it's both physical. So for me, there was a biological aspect to it. It was like my serotonin levels are off, and that meant my gut wasn't working and I wasn't getting the right neurotransmitters up to my brain. So there was a biological side of things. And then there's the whole belief system underneath that. You know what I mean? It's like, I healed the physical or biological, physiological part of my body first. But after that, the story, the mental belief system that I had was still there. So it was like, I got rid of the initial part of depression and anxiety. Yay, I can function much more readily. But the stories we tell, like the fears that might be affecting us, are that underlying, trickle that kind of like breaks our foundation until we can figure it out. And then that's finding someone that you can work with to help you get or face that fear and get through the fear and reconcile with the fear or the trauma or the, whatever it was. So yeah, I hear you. I cried a lot those first 3 years, and yeah, just lying with the baby, crying like, oh, but I just had a baby. So I, of course, new moms cry, and it's like, well, that was 3 years ago. Like now it's not crying with the baby because you just had a baby. Now it's depression. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. And I just want to go back to what you were saying about Asians are told to not show emotions. I want to talk more about that because my mom, like last year, I told her that a lot of Asians have mental health problems, and she's like, Asians have mental health problems? Are you kidding me? Like, we don't have mental health problems. I told her, like, no, that's not true. A lot of us do, but what you don't see is because, like, why you don't know that we have mental health problems, because we don't talk about these things. And that's why.
And we're not taught to.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel like my mother was going through the horrible sudden death of her number one true love. And yet there was no discussion about that. Not even within our family. It was like, suck it up. We're going to deal with this. Dad's gone and we're going to make this happen. So just like put your nose to the grind. That was it.
Yeah.
And there was the little bit of like, we're going to go out every major holiday to his gravesite and do the whole ritual, but there wasn't grieving and there wasn't connection. It was just trauma. So I agree. We don't talk about it. And we're not allowed to show it because put your nose to the grind. Yeah. It's terrible. I hope things are changing. I work actually at a college wellness center where I'm the coordinator of the program, which means I hear students' stories all the time. And I hope that I'm an example where, Asian people are allowed to show the same stress and overwhelm and depression and anxiety and stuckness and heartbreak, all the feelings that everyone else is supposed to feel or can feel. We can do that too. And I'm an example of it. And I talk about that when I work with my students. It's like, yeah, this is hard, and it's allowed to be hard because it's been hard. And I can say it, even though maybe when I was 21, I couldn't. Now I can, and I can acknowledge that. So I hope that we're getting to a better place.
Yeah, and I believe for everyone, not just Asians to speak up, but everyone be able to have a chance to speak up from different cultures too, because like the Black community, the Hispanic community, there's certain times in their lives that where they might not be able to speak up sometimes, and so it's just allow everyone the chance to speak up and be able to just stand up for themselves.
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on this podcast, and I just started a Facebook group as well. It's called We Speak Loud Squad.
Okay, great. I will definitely join, of course.
I'll leave the link.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Of course. To tune in to more episodes, please go to anchor.fm/We Speak Loud. And also follow me on